The sound of wood cracking against my ribs stole the air from my lungs in an instant, leaving me gasping on the polished floor as though the entire house had collapsed on top of me. My stepfather, Gerald Thompson, towered above me, his broad frame outlined against the chandelier light, cigar smoke curling lazily around his smirk. The pain radiated through my chest, sharp and suffocating, but even sharper was the sting of my mother's words that followed. "Clumsy as always, Anna. Stop making drama." Her tone was cold, almost rehearsed, as though she had prepared that line for years, ready to deploy whenever Gerald's violence became too obvious to ignore. My name is Anna Walker, and at 27 years old, I had just experienced the blow that would shatter not only my ribs, but also the illusion I had carried for so long that silence was my safest choice. Gerald had ordered me to carry trays and refill glasses for his cousin Michael, a 40-year-old man with greasy hair and the entitled smirk of someone who lived off the favors of others. The evening was supposed to be a family gathering, but to Gerald it was a performance his house, a stage where he could show off control. When I refused to serve like a maid, his eyes hardened and the tension in the room grew thick. "You will do as you are told," he hissed before lifting the heavy wooden chair as if it weighed nothing and slamming it against my side. The sound was sickening, followed by my scream, followed by his laughter. My knees buckled my cheek, hit the cold marble, and a flash of white pain blinded me. My mother did not rush to help me. She did not demand he stop. She only scolded me as though I were a child making a mess. Her pearls glistened at her neck, her lips pursed in irritation, and her eyes slid away from my body, twisted on the floor. Michael chuckled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Maybe she deserves a lesson," he muttered, sipping his drink. The humiliation seared deeper than the physical agony. In that moment, I was not their daughter, not their family. I was a problem to be silenced, a nuisance to be mocked. My chest heaved as I tried to breathe. Each inhale stabbed like a knife. Each exhale burned. The chandelier above blurred the edges of the world, trembling. Gerald lowered himself to my level, crouching, his cigar hanging from his lips. "This house works my way," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "Remember that." Then he stood again, brushing off his suit as though nothing had happened, as though I was not broken at his feet. My mother walked past me without looking down, carrying empty glasses to the kitchen. Her silence screamed louder than any insult. For a moment, I wondered if I was invisible, if the pain in my ribs was only in my imagination, but then another jolt reminded me this was all too real. I curled into myself, trembling tears hot on my face, the laughter of Gerald and Michael echoing in the background. I had learned to endure. Since I was a child, I had swallowed apologies that were not mine, accepted blame that never belonged to me. Pretended accidents explained bruises. But tonight, something cracked inside me, something far deeper than bone. As I lay there, chest burning, I realized this was not just another night of violence. This was the final strike, the one that shifted everything. My mother's voice still rang in my ears, dismissing me as clumsy, as dramatic, as less than human. But my mind screamed louder. I knew now that if I stayed silent, I would disappear piece by piece until nothing remained of Anna Walker. The pain was unbearable, yet inside that agony sparked something I had not felt in years: defiance. I forced my eyes open, forced myself to see the chandelier again, to focus on the small details, the cut crystal, the shimmer of light, because those details meant I was still here, still alive, still capable of choosing. The chair had cracked my ribs, but it had also awakened me. For years, Gerald's control and my mother's complicity had written the script of my life. Tonight, for the first time, I decided to write my own. The humiliation, the gaslighting, the betrayal, it all crystallized into a single vow. This was the night I would end their power over me. This was the night I would start the war that would expose every secret they had buried. And though my body was broken, my will had never been stronger. The morning after the chair shattered my ribs, I woke to a sharp ache that pulsed with every breath, a reminder of Gerald's rage and my mother's indifference. The house was silent now, the echoes of last night's laughter replaced by the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I lay still on my bed, staring at the ceiling, every inhale stabbing me, every exhale trembling with suppressed anger. This house had once been my safe place when my real father was alive. A modest home filled with laughter and warmth, but after his sudden death when I was 10, everything changed. My mother, Linda, remarried Gerald when I was 12, and from the very first day he walked in with his heavy boots and commanding voice, the air inside these walls shifted from comfort to fear. Gerald was a man who liked control more than companionship. He ran his business like a king, his employees trembling at his presence, and he brought that same domineering authority into our home. To outsiders, he looked polished, a respected figure in the community, but behind closed doors, his temper ruled every hour. My mother seemed to melt into his shadow, her once gentle voice now used mostly to scold me, her smiles reserved for him and his circle. I was the reminder of her first marriage, the child of another man, and while she never said it outright, her behavior made it clear that I was an obstacle to her new life. For years, I thought if I worked harder, if I smiled more, if I tried to please her, she would see me as her daughter again, but instead, the distance only grew wider. Gerald made sure of it, planting small seeds of disdain every time I made a mistake, every time I hesitated to follow his orders. Linda would sigh and shake her head, telling me I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too difficult, until I began to believe her. Now, at 27, I worked as a nurse's aide at a local clinic, a job that gave me a glimpse of independence, but not enough to escape. My mother insisted I live at home to help with chores, to be present for family gatherings, to maintain appearances. Whenever I mentioned moving out, Gerald would sneer and Linda would guilt me, asking how she would manage without me. They didn't need me, but they wanted me tethered, a silent servant disguised as a daughter. I remembered being 16 and bringing home a college brochure, the excitement glowing in my chest, only for Gerald to laugh and tell me no school would accept someone like me, and even if they did, who would take care of the house? Linda had nodded along, her silence cutting deeper than his words. Those small betrayals stacked up a tower of disappointments that crushed my dreams one by one. Yet last night's attack was different, not just another blow, but a fracture of the entire illusion that keeping quiet would protect me. I thought of my father, the man whose laughter once filled this place, and wondered what he would think if he could see his daughter reduced to a shadow, treated as a burden in her own home. The ache in my chest deepened, but with it came a sharper determination. For too long, I had been the background character in their story, the girl who absorbed every insult and covered every bruise. That morning, as sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, I realized I could not keep playing that role. The past had shaped me, yes, but it did not have to define me. The setup of my life had been written by others, by Gerald's dominance, by my mother's silence, by the expectations that I should simply endure. But for the first time, I was ready to pick up the pen myself. I pressed my hand gently against my rib cage, wincing at the pain, and whispered to the empty room, "This ends with me." The day of the family gathering began like any other performance orchestrated by Gerald Thompson, a display of wealth and control designed to impress relatives and remind everyone of his authority. The dining room sparkled with polished silverware, crystal glasses, and an oversized roast positioned like a trophy in the center of the table. I moved carefully each step, sending a dull ache through my ribs, but I kept my expression neutral, determined not to show weakness. Gerald thrived on weakness. He sat at the head of the table, his cigar resting in an ashtray, his presence dominating the room like a general surveying his troops. His cousin Michael arrived late, swaggering in with the smell of cheap cologne and the careless arrogance of someone who had never lifted responsibility in his life. Gerald welcomed him with a slap on the back and a booming laugh, then turned his eyes toward me. "Anna, bring the wine for Michael. He is our guest, and you will serve him tonight." The words sank into me like ice. I felt every gaze shift in my direction. My hand instinctively pressed against my side where the bruise from last night throbbed under my blouse. "No," I said quietly but firmly, my voice steady though my heart pounded. For a moment, the room stilled, forks paused mid-air, glasses halted before lips. Gerald's smile froze, then cracked. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his shadow stretching long across the polished table. "What did you say?" His voice was low, dangerous, the kind of voice that made people flinch. I swallowed hard but forced myself to repeat it. "I will not serve like a maid. Not tonight. Not ever again." Gasps echoed from relatives who were unaccustomed to seeing me defy him. Michael smirked, leaning back in his chair as though enjoying a private show. "Your girl has some fire," he sneered, and that smirk was gasoline on Gerald's fury. He grabbed the nearest chair, his hands gripping the wood as if it were an extension of his rage, and before I could move, he swung it with brute force into my side. The impact was thunderous, ripping through my ribs like fire, stealing every ounce of breath from my lungs. I collapsed onto the floor, clutching my chest, the world spinning around me. A scream escaped, but it was smothered by the laughter that followed. Michael chuckled, raising his glass in mock celebration. Gerald loomed over me, his breath heavy with alcohol and smoke. "You will never embarrass me again," he spat. "My mother!" Linda rushed forward, but not to help me. Instead, she lifted the shards of the broken chair and hissed at me. "Get up! Stop being dramatic! You're ruining the evening." Her words pierced deeper than the fracture in my bones. The relatives avoided my eyes, their heads bent toward their plates, unwilling to challenge Gerald, unwilling to acknowledge the battered woman lying on the floor before them. I could barely inhale without stabbing pain, but I forced my mind to focus, to burn this moment into memory. The humiliation, the betrayal, the laughter echoing in my ears, these would be the fuel. Gerald shoved me with his foot, not hard enough to draw attention, just enough to remind me of my place. "Stay down if you cannot obey," he muttered, returning to his seat as though nothing had happened. My mother straightened the tablecloth, plastering a brittle smile for the guests, pretending the crack of bone was only clumsy theatrics. I lay on the floor, my cheek pressed against the cold marble, tasting salt and dust, my body trembling. Each breath was a war, each attempt to rise another stab of agony, but inside my mind, something else rose stronger than the pain. This was no longer about survival, no longer about keeping peace. The escalation was complete. Gerald had crossed the final line, and my mother had chosen her side. As Michael lifted his glass and toasted to Gerald's authority, I swore silently that I would never again be their silent victim. If my ribs were broken, so be it. The fracture would heal, but my spirit would not bend. I would find a way to expose them, to strip away the masks they wore to show the world what they had done. The night of the family gathering was meant to celebrate Gerald's power, but instead, it became the night that ignited mine. Lying on the cold marble floor of that dining room, my ribs throbbing with every shallow breath, my mind did what it always did when pain became unbearable. It slipped backward into memories that I had tried to bury. Memories that explained why this latest act of violence was not an isolated event, but the continuation of a long and deliberate pattern. I was 12 when Gerald first came into our lives, carrying an expensive watch and a booming voice that filled the silence my father's death had left behind. At first, I had thought perhaps he would protect us, that maybe my mother would smile again, but those illusions shattered quickly. One of my earliest memories of his temper came when I was scrubbing the kitchen floor on my knees, my hands raw from the harsh soap because he had declared the tiles unacceptable for a man of his status. I had missed a spot under the table, a tiny streak of grease, and he grabbed the back of my neck, pressing my face close to the floor until my cheek burned from the pressure. "Do it right, or don't do it at all," he barked, and when I cried, my mother only shook her head and muttered, "He's strict, Anna, but it's for your own good." At 16, the violence became less about chores and more about control over who I could see. I remember bringing home a boy from school, nervous but excited, hoping my mother might approve, but Gerald met us at the door, his face darkening at the sight. Later that evening, while the boy waited outside, Gerald slapped me so hard my ears rang, accusing me of shaming the family by acting fast. The boy never came back, and I spent the night icing my cheek in silence, listening as my mother told Gerald in the next room that she agreed with him that I was too reckless, too easily led astray. The betrayal cut deeper than the slap. At 19, things escalated again. Gerald had been drinking heavily after some business loss, and I made the mistake of asking if he was all right. He lunged at me, his hands around my throat, pressing me against the wall until black spots clouded my vision. My mother pulled him back, but not with anger or outrage, only with a cold plea. Not too hard. Gerald, she still has to help tomorrow. Later that night, she pressed a wet cloth to the bruises blooming on my neck and told me, "Stop provoking him, Anna. You know how he gets when he's stressed." The pattern was established, and my body became a canvas for his anger and her excuses. At 20, I tried again to carve out independence by applying for college scholarships. I remember hiding the acceptance letter under my pillow, reading the words over and over, feeling the possibility of freedom for the first time. But Gerald found it, and with a smirk, he tore the paper into pieces before my eyes, telling me no school would want a girl who could not even manage her own house. My mother stood beside him, her silence permission enough, and just like that, my future crumbled in confetti on the floor. Around that same year, Gerald slammed the car door on my hand during an argument over curfew. The pain was blinding, my fingers swelling immediately, but once again my mother's only words were, "Tell the doctor, you shut it yourself, Anna, do not embarrass us." Each hospital visit became another carefully constructed lie, each bruise explained away as clumsiness, each fracture labeled an accident. With every incident, I believed their version a little less, but I had no ally to turn to, no one who would stand beside me and say this was wrong. My reflection in the mirror became the only witness, the eyes staring back, carrying the silent question, "How much longer can you survive this?" Now, years later on the floor of that dining room, my ribs screaming and my spirit flickering, the montage of these flashbacks collided into one truth. I had not been unlucky or careless. I had been systematically broken down, gaslighted until even I questioned reality. The chair that cracked against me tonight was only the latest in a long series of blows, meant to keep me small, silent, and compliant. Yet in remembering the past, I felt the stirring of defiance grow stronger. These memories were no longer just scars, they were evidence testimony etched into my bones. And if my own mother refused to acknowledge them, then I would find others who would. For years, I had been taught to apologize, to hide, to endure, but as my cheek pressed into the marble and my lungs fought for air, I swore I would no longer be the silent witness to my own suffering. The flashbacks did not crush me. This time, they steeled me. The hours that followed the violent dinner blurred into a haze of pain, but the sharpest wounds were carved not by Gerald's chair, but by the words my mother delivered with clinical precision. I tried to retreat into my room, moving slowly, clutching my side with each breath, but Linda followed, carrying a bottle of over-the-counter painkillers and a glass of water. For a brief moment, I thought she might finally show concern, that maybe seeing me gasping for air would pierce through the armor of denial she wore so tightly. Instead, she placed the pills on my desk with a sharp clink and crossed her arms. "You need to stop exaggerating," she said, her tone colder than the glass window catching the moonlight. "If you keep acting dramatic, people will think you're unstable. Gerald was only trying to correct your disrespect, and you will not breathe a word of this outside. Do you understand?" My ribs ached, but the greater ache came from her betrayal, the complete absence of maternal care. I wanted to scream, to beg her to see me, but the lump in my throat swallowed my words. She handed me the pills as though performing a routine chore, then turned away, leaving me to battle the pain alone. Minutes later, my phone buzzed, and when I lifted it from the nightstand, Gerald's name glared across the screen. The message was short, brutal in its simplicity. "If you tell anyone, you will regret it." Another vibration brought my mother's text, a mirror of her loyalty to him. "Family must protect each other. Drop this. Be smart." My chest tightened, not only from the fractured ribs, but from the suffocating sense that I had no ally under this roof. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on breathing without crying out. Even the faintest sob sent lightning bolts of agony through my side. The house creaked around me, every sound reminding me that Gerald's authority stretched into every corner and my mother's silence guarded the doors. Alone in my room, I replayed their words until they twisted like chains, convincing me that maybe I was clumsy, maybe I had provoked him, maybe the humiliation was deserved. Gaslighting is not a single strike. It is a repeated drip, a steady erosion of truth until the victim doubts even the evidence of her own body. But beneath the despair, something else flickered. The texts, the cold dismissal, the threats, they were proof, and proof was power. I clutched my phone tighter, saving each message like a seed of rebellion. For the first time, I saw their fear for what it truly was. Not worry for my health, but terror that the truth might escape the walls of this house. They did not want outsiders, doctors, neighbors, or authorities to glimpse the cracks in the perfect facade. That realization steadied me. If they feared exposure, then exposure was my weapon. The night stretched on long and merciless. Each attempt to shift on the mattress sent pain stabbing through my ribs. I thought of the flashbacks that haunted me, the countless times I had been told to apologize to hide the bruises to protect Gerald's reputation. My body had been treated as collateral damage in my mother's desperate bid to keep her marriage intact. But something had changed. I was no longer a child with no choice. I had a job, a small income, a voice, and most importantly, a will that refused to vanish. Just before dawn, I sat upright despite the agony and whispered to the shadows of my room, "I will not let this be buried." My words trembled, but they existed, and that was enough. The gaslighting that once silenced me now ignited a different resolve. If my own family insisted on treating me as invisible, then I would force the world to see me. The morning light pierced through the blinds like sharp blades, and though every rib protested, I knew I could not stay in that house another hour without taking action. Moving slowly, wincing with each step, I dressed in the plainest clothes I had, pulling a sweater tight to disguise the swelling. My mother knocked once on the door and slid a note under it, her handwriting neat and detached. "Do not go to the hospital. Rest. Do not make a scene." I stared at the words until they blurred, then folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my bag. That note would serve as another piece of evidence, another reminder of where her loyalty lay. Driving to the clinic felt like navigating through fire. Every bump in the road jolted my chest, forcing gasps from my lips, but the thought of staying silent was far more unbearable. When I finally staggered into the waiting room, the receptionist's eyes widened, and within minutes, I was led to an exam room. The nurse asked the usual intake questions, but when I hesitated to describe how I had been injured, she tilted her head, her expression soft. "You do not have to hide," she said gently. Something in her tone broke through the years of training, and I whispered, "My stepfather hit me with a chair." For the first time in so long, I said it plainly. No excuses, no lies. The nurse nodded slowly, as if validating not just the words, but the courage it took to speak them, and wrote carefully in my chart. Soon after, Dr. Rebecca Moore entered, a tall woman in her 50s with silver streaks in her hair and eyes that missed nothing. She listened silently as I repeated the truth, then ordered X-rays and an MRI. Lying in the imaging machine, the hum surrounding me, I thought of every bruise I had concealed, every hospital visit explained away, and I prayed the scans would tell the story I had been forced to hide. When the images returned, Dr. Moore's face grew grave. She turned the monitor toward me, pointing at the jagged lines, the faint scars etched across my bones. "Anna, this injury is severe, but it is not the only one. Your ribs show evidence of repeated trauma over many years. Your body has been keeping records that your family tried to erase." Her words carried both sorrow and steel. My throat tightened, not only from the pain, but from the weight of finally being believed. Tears pricked my eyes, not of weakness, but of release. Dr. Moore's next words anchored me to reality. "By law, I must report this. You are not alone anymore. We will take this further." Relief and terror crashed together inside me. Reporting meant war, and war meant retaliation, but the alternative was endless silence. "Do it," I whispered. Minutes later, a knock on the door introduced Detective Samuel Harris, a man in his early 40s with a calm voice that carried authority without intimidation. He listened as I recounted years of abuse, his pen moving steadily across the notepad, but unlike the interrogations my family once staged at home, his questions were not designed to trap me, they were designed to free me. He asked about past hospital visits, about broken fingers, concussions, and slammed doors, and each memory surfaced like a ghost finally acknowledged. Your records show patterns that cannot be explained by accidents, he said firmly. This is a case of ongoing domestic violence, and we will act. My phone buzzed again with messages from my mother and Gerald, threats and demands, but this time I did not panic. I handed the device to Detective Harris, who read them with narrowed eyes. These will serve as evidence, he assured me. As the weight of years began to lift, another unexpected ally stepped into my story. Mrs. Allen, our elderly neighbor, visited me at the clinic after hearing whispers from another patient. She took my hand, her wrinkled face filled with regret. I knew something was wrong, she said quietly. I saw the way you flinched around him. I should have spoken sooner, but I will speak now. If you need me, I will testify. Her words pierced me with both sorrow and gratitude. For the first time, I saw a small army forming around me. A doctor who believed me a detective who would act, and a neighbor who would stand as witness. Allies had appeared, and with them came a fragile but undeniable hope. After decades of silence gathering evidence against the people who had raised me, felt like peeling away layers of armor I had worn so long I forgot where they ended and I began. But now, with Detective Harris's backing and Dr. Moore's testimony, the silence was cracking, and for the first time I saw a path forward that didn't end with me swallowing my pain. The scans from the MRI were definitive, showing not only the fresh break in my rib cage, but also older healed fractures that aligned with the dates I had quietly tucked into the margins of my memory. Broken finger at age 12, concussion at 16, compression injury to my hand at 20. All logged at different hospitals, all marked as accidents, each one dismissed with a whispered instruction from my mother not to embarrass the family. Tell them you fell down the stairs. Say you slipped in the shower. Do not say a word about Gerald. But now, the medical records spoke louder than any lie. Detective Harris compiled the charts and matched each injury to a timeline based on school records, ER visits, and prescription history. The pattern was irrefutable. This is not a single outburst. This is systematic abuse, he stated during our second meeting, flipping through the growing folder. Dr. Moore added her notes, emphasizing in bold ink that the damage could only be caused by repeated high-impact trauma. Your ribs read like a diary, she told me gently. One your family can't burn. Still, it wasn't enough. Gerald had influence friends in city departments, a reputation as a community donor. He knew how to play the charming gentleman, and I knew he would twist the narrative the moment he sensed danger. I needed more than my word and my wounds. I needed undeniable proof of what happened behind closed doors. That's when I remembered the security system installed in our home 2 years ago, a gift from Gerald to himself to monitor packages and guests. What he didn't realize was that the system stored footage automatically in a backup drive hidden in a panel near the laundry room, something he showed off once to a neighbor and promptly forgot. I called Mrs. Allen, our neighbor and now witness, and asked her to help. Can you get inside when no one's home? I asked. I'll guide you step by step. She didn't hesitate. While Gerald and my mother were at an appointment the next morning, she slipped in through the side door using the spare key under the planter found at the panel and carefully removed the backup drive. Within an hour, she brought it to the precinct, clutching it like sacred cargo. Detective Harris had the IT team pull footage from the night of the family dinner. I sat next to him watching with a clenched jaw as the screen showed exactly what I had described. Gerald ordering me to serve Michael, me refusing. Gerald standing, the chair lifted, the impact, my body crumpling, my mother's indifference, Michael's laugh, every cruel second preserved in crystal clarity. This changes everything, Harris murmured. They can lie, this can't. Alongside the medical records and the threatening messages on my phone, we now had video footage showing Gerald's assault and my mother's complicity. It was the final piece. We filed for an emergency protective order that afternoon. The judge reviewed the footage privately and granted it within the hour, banning Gerald from contacting me and officially naming Linda as a complicit party. That night, I moved into a small guest room at Dr. Moore's sister's house. She didn't ask questions, just handed me fresh sheets and told me I was safe. But I wasn't interested in just being safe. I wanted justice. With Harris's help, we began preparing for the next phase, the confrontation that would bring it all into the open. Gerald and Linda were summoned for formal questioning, but they denied everything, claiming I was mentally unstable, accusing me of fabricating injuries for attention. They spoke with calm tones, practiced eyes the same way they had handled years of keeping up appearances. But this time they didn't know what I had. They didn't know the MRI scans had already been submitted. They didn't know the footage was already backed up in 3 separate locations. And they didn't know that while they schemed to cover their tracks, their network of silence had already collapsed. As I stood in front of the mirror in that guest room, bandages still wrapped around my ribs, I looked myself in the eye without flinching. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. And I wasn't waiting for someone to save me. I had built my own case, brick by brick, wound by wound. And soon, the truth would be louder than their reputation, stronger than their lies, and impossible to ignore. The courthouse was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in silence, a heavy stillness that settled over everything, like dust in an abandoned room. I sat at the front of the courtroom beside Detective Harris, my ribs still aching beneath the fitted blazer I had borrowed from Dr. Moore's sister, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. Across the aisle, Gerald sat with his chin lifted, wearing a tailored navy suit that couldn't hide the smugness in his eyes, as though he still believed his name and charm would dissolve all accusations. Linda sat behind him, her expression unreadable, dressed in muted gray, as if mourning a daughter she had never truly defended. The judge entered, and the session began. The prosecution started with the basics, my medical records laid out like a roadmap of injuries, each incident supported by corresponding hospital reports and emergency visits. The MRI scans were displayed on the screen to the jury, grainy in resolution but devastating in implication. Dr. Moore took the stand first. Calm and clinical, she explained the physical damage in terms the jury could understand. The current injury is a rib fracture caused by significant blunt force. But what's most disturbing, she pointed to older images, are these signs of previously healed fractures and soft tissue damage consistent with repetitive trauma over several years. This is not the result of isolated incidents. This is prolonged physical abuse. She never raised her voice, but the silence that followed her testimony was louder than any shout. Then came the footage. The moment the video played, a wave of discomfort rippled through the courtroom. The grainy home security footage showed Gerald standing, lifting the chair and bringing it down with brutal force against my side. My scream was audible. The crash of the wood against my ribs echoed from the speakers. And then my mother's words, clear as day. "Stop being dramatic." Gasps rose from the jury box. One of the women on the front row covered her mouth. Gerald's lawyer tried to object, claiming the footage was taken without consent, but the judge overruled it, citing it as legally obtained and relevant. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, the bruises mostly faded, but the weight of memory fresh. My voice shook at first, but steadied with every word. I told them about the first slap, the broken finger, the slammed car door, the college letter torn to shreds. I told them how I was told to lie to doctors to blame myself to protect a man who never saw me as human. And I told them about my mother, about the betrayal that cut deeper than the bruises. My body kept the truth, even when I couldn't speak it, I said, holding up a printed copy of my X-ray. But now I can. And I won't be silent again. The defense tried to paint me as unstable, as attention-seeking, pulling out photos from years before, where I was smiling at family events, trying to create doubt. But they couldn't explain the scans. They couldn't explain the footage. They couldn't explain why a neighbor, Mrs. Allen, was willing to testify under oath that she had heard arguments, crashes, even crying through the walls. She spoke gently but firmly. I should have said something sooner. She admitted her voice breaking, but I'm saying it now. My mother was called to testify. She sat stiffly, her hands folded, eyes downcast. The prosecutor's questions were sharp. "Mrs. Walker, do you deny that your daughter has been hospitalized multiple times during your marriage to Mr. Thompson?" "No," she said. "Do you deny instructing her to lie to medical professionals?" I was trying to keep peace in the home. Is that why you told her to say she was clumsy? Is that why you told her to say she slipped?" My mother said nothing. The silence was damning. Were you protecting her or were you protecting him? Still, she said nothing. The prosecution rested their case. The jury left to deliberate, and I sat waiting every second, stretching like a lifetime. Then the verdict came. Guilty. Gerald was convicted on all counts: aggravated assault, domestic battery, and witness intimidation. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in prison with no chance of parole for at least 7. My mother was found guilty of criminal neglect and obstruction of justice. She was sentenced to 18 months probation, mandatory therapy, and ordered to issue a formal public apology. As Gerald was led away in handcuffs, he turned, once eyes burning with a fury that no longer frightened me. He couldn't touch me anymore. He had lost. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. The footage had gone public, the community reeling at the contrast between the man they thought they knew and the violence he had hidden for so long. I said little to the press, only this: no family image is worth hiding abuse. No name, no legacy, no lie is worth more than a life. That night, I sat alone in a hotel room paid for by the Victim Support Office, looking out the window as rain streaked the glass. For the first time in years, I exhaled without flinching. The truth had spoken, and it was louder than their denial. The weeks that followed the verdict moved both quickly and slowly, a strange contradiction that felt like waking from a nightmare, only to find that real life was still adjusting to the truth. Gerald Thompson, once the commanding patriarch in polished suits and Sunday sermons, was now an inmate with an ID number awaiting transfer to a state facility. His sentencing, 10 years with no early parole, hit the local press like a thunderclap. Headlines labeled him a community deceiver, a man who wore respectability as a costume while destroying the life of the stepdaughter under his roof. His name, once linked to charity events and city fundraisers, was now attached to mugshots and public disgrace. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing a second time. I didn't need to watch him be processed by the system. I had seen enough of his face. What mattered was that he could no longer hurt me, no longer command a room with fear, no longer stand above me while I trembled beneath his power. He was exactly where he belonged. As for my mother, Linda Walker, the court's decision was complex and in some ways more painful than Gerald's fate. She wasn't sentenced to prison, but to something else, a long unraveling of her denial. The 18 months of probation came with conditions, therapy sessions, a restraining order that kept her from contacting me directly, and a mandatory apology delivered through the court. That letter arrived by certified mail 2 weeks later, folded neatly into 3 stiff lines. The words were clinical, devoid of emotion, likely drafted by her attorney. She expressed regret for my suffering, acknowledged a failure to act, and stated she had been under pressure and fear. But there was no love in her sentences, no warmth, no maternal voice. It was a statement for the record, not for the heart. I placed the letter in the back of a folder with court documents and never looked at it again. The community's reaction was swift and sharp. Some people avoided me at the grocery store, unsure of what to say. Others approached quietly, offering gentle words or sometimes just a nod. But what surprised me most were the people who reached out because my story gave them the courage to confront their own. 2 of Gerald's former employees submitted complaints to his old company describing verbal abuse and inappropriate behavior. One of his ex-girlfriends from years before sent a letter to the court describing an incident where he shoved her during an argument, something she had never reported. And then there was Michael, the cousin who had laughed while I lay gasping for breath. He issued a public statement through a family lawyer claiming he misunderstood the severity of the incident and deeply regretted his laughter. But I knew the truth. Michael had simply been afraid of guilt by association. He wasn't sorry. He was just distancing himself from a sinking ship. The legal consequences had come swiftly, but the emotional consequences were slower, heavier. Every morning, I still felt for the pain in my ribs, tracing the outline of the fracture, as if reminding myself that it really happened, that I wasn't making it up, that my body had been speaking when my voice could not. But more than that, I felt something I hadn't in years: relief. The war was not over, but the front lines had moved. I was no longer defending myself in the dark. The truth had been dragged into the light. Gerald was in prison. Linda was exposed. The community had seen behind the curtain. Justice didn't restore what I lost, but it gave shape to what I could build next. 1 year after the trial, I stood at the edge of a quiet community center in a neighboring town, watching a group of women and a few men filter into a room with folding chairs and warm lighting. Most of them didn't speak as they entered. Some avoided eye contact. Others clutched bags tightly or wore sunglasses indoors. The signs were familiar and unmistakable. I had once looked exactly like them. Nervous, fragile, unsure if I belonged in a space where truth was allowed to live outside the walls of shame. I had been invited by a domestic violence support group to share my story, not because I was special, but because my case had gained attention not just in local news, but in state medical circles. Dr. Moore had submitted my injury timeline and courtroom testimony to a training program she developed for young doctors using my history as a model of what prolonged trauma looks like when the system fails to notice. My MRI scans, anonymized, were now part of lectures across hospitals. Your spine told the truth, she had said. Now it will help others learn how to listen. That sentence stayed with me. Bodies keep records, and mine had recorded years of fear, silence, and injury. But now it recorded something else: survival. As I stepped to the front of the room and began to speak, I didn't tell them only about the chair or the ribs or the betrayal. I told them about the small moments too. The first time I lied for Gerald at the clinic. The first time I believed my mother more than my own instincts. The moment I realized that love given with conditions isn't love at all. And then I told them how I fought. The documentation, the recordings, the witnesses, the truth that refused to stay buried. I watched people sit straighter as I spoke, their silence transforming into focus. I ended not with anger, but with a promise. If no one else believes, you believe yourself first. That's where it begins. Afterward, a woman came up to me and said, I haven't told anyone yet, but I think I'm ready to start. That night, back at the small home I now rented near the lake, I curled up on a couch with a mug of tea and my journal, flipping to the first page where I had written a vow the week after the assault. You will never bury me again. I smiled at those words, not bitterly, but with quiet strength. Healing had not been quick or clean. The nightmares still came sometimes, the kind where I heard my mother's voice telling me I was exaggerating, where I saw Gerald's eyes in the courtroom fixed on me with contempt. But in the mornings I woke, knowing he could not reach me anymore. And the pain in my ribs had faded to a dull reminder rather than a constant scream. Mrs. Allen visited, often bringing over baked bread or fresh fruit from the farmer's market, and though she rarely spoke about the trial, she always hugged me a little longer than necessary before leaving. She had become a quiet guardian, a living reminder that help sometimes comes from the places you least expect. I also reconnected with a few cousins on my father's side, people my mother had distanced me from. One of them, Claire, invited me to a Thanksgiving dinner, and though I almost didn't go, I did. And when they asked if I was okay, I told the truth. I'm getting there. Slowly I built routines: morning walks, weekly therapy, group meetings, volunteering at shelters. I didn't just want to move on. I wanted to rebuild with purpose. I started working with a nonprofit focused on helping abuse survivors document their injuries safely and legally, offering guidance on how to gather and preserve evidence, even when trust feels impossible. The files I had kept, texts, photos, medical records, became templates we used in workshops. I wasn't just a case study anymore. I was someone others looked to as proof that there is life after control, light after silence. One afternoon I received a letter. Not from my mother, not from Gerald, but from a high school girl who had seen my story online. She wrote, My stepdad hasn't hit me yet, but he screams. He breaks things. My mom says I make him angry. But after watching what you did, I told my school counselor. She believed me. Thank you. I sat with that letter in my lap for a long time, the weight of it heavier than any verdict. It was then I truly understood. The point of surviving isn't just to be free. It's to make sure someone else finds the courage to fight sooner than you did. My ribs had healed. My name had survived. And the truth, once exposed, had done what silence never could. It had changed everything.